The sound of the gavel crashed through the dusty air like a crack of lightning, silencing the rowdy crowd that had gathered in Sweetwater's town square on that scorching July afternoon in 1876. Bethany Foster stood trembling on the makeshift auction block, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves around her dirt-smudged face, the worn calico dress hanging from her thin frame like a faded memory of better days. $2, called out the auctioneer, a portly man with yellowed teeth and beady eyes. Do I hear $2 for this fine young woman? Good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever else you might fancy. His laughter sent chills down Bethany's spine as she kept her gaze fixed on the weathered boards beneath her feet. The crowd murmured, and Bethany's heart sank. She knew what it meant to be sold so cheaply. After her father's death and the foreclosure of their small farm, she'd been seized for her father's debts, reduced to property to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. But $2, that wasn't even enough to buy a decent saddle. Men who paid that little for a woman had no plans to treat her with dignity. $2 going once, the auctioneer called. A large, bearded man near the front, smelling of whiskey even from where Bethany stood, grinned and raised his hand. I'll take her for $2, he slurred. Bethany bit her lip to keep from crying out. She recognized him as Jeb Thornton, the owner of the saloon at the edge of town, a man known for his cruelty toward his employees. $2 going twice, $100. The voice cut through the crowd like a knife, strong and clear. The crowd parted, and a tall figure stepped forward. The sun caught on his silver spurs as he approached the auction block, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. When he lifted his head, Bethany saw a pair of gray eyes set in a tanned, weathered face, stubbled with several days' growth of beard. Marshall Ingram, someone whispered from the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes widened. Did you say $100, Mr. Ingram? The cowboy nodded, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a small leather pouch. I did. Well, I'll be. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $100 going once, going twice. Sold. To Mr. Marshall Ingram. Bethany's legs nearly gave way beneath her. $100 was a small fortune in these parts. She watched, stunned, as the cowboy counted out the money and handed it to the auctioneer, who was now treating him with remarkable deference. Marshall Ingram then turned toward her, removing his hat. Miss, he said, extending a hand to help her down from the platform. If you'd be so kind as to accompany me. With nowhere else to go and no other choice, Bethany placed her trembling hand in his and stepped down from the auction block. My wagon's over there, he said, nodding toward a well-maintained wagon hitched to two strong-looking horses. He didn't touch her beyond helping her down from the platform, keeping a respectful distance as they walked. Why? Bethany finally managed to ask when they reached the wagon. Why would you pay so much? Marshall Ingram looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. No person should be sold for $2, miss, or for any amount. He opened the wagon door for her. I've got a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. You can work there as my housekeeper if you'd like. Your own room, regular meals and wages, or I can take you somewhere else if you prefer. You're not my property, despite what that farce of an auction might suggest. Bethany stared at him, unable to comprehend that this might not be a cruel joke. You're offering me a job, I am, he nodded. My last housekeeper left to get married 2 months back. Place is getting to be a right mess. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile. But the choice is yours. Tears sprang to Bethany's eyes, but she blinked them back. Pride was about all she had left. I'll work for you, Mr. Ingram. And I'll earn back every cent of that $100. For the first time, a genuine smile crossed his face, transforming his stern features. Marshall, he corrected gently. And I've no doubt you will, Miss Foster. The journey to Marshall's ranch passed mostly in silence. Bethany was too overwhelmed to make conversation, and Marshall seemed content with the quiet, occasionally pointing out landmarks or telling her the names of distant mountains. The land grew wilder as they left town behind, the prairie stretching endlessly under the vast blue sky. When they crested a small hill, Bethany caught her first glimpse of the ranch, a sturdy two-story house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, a corral with horses, and beyond that, cattle grazing on the open range. "It's not much," Marshall said, misreading her awed expression. "But it's home." "It's beautiful," Bethany breathed, and she meant it. After months of uncertainty and fear, just the sight of solid walls and a roof made her heart swell with something like hope. As they pulled up to the house, a young boy of about 12 came running from the barn, his face lighting up at the sight of Marshall. "You're back," he called, then stopped short when he noticed Bethany. "Who's she?" "Thomas, mind your manners," Marshall said, though his tone was gentle. "This is Miss Foster. She'll be helping us keep the house in order. Miss Foster, this is my nephew Thomas. He lives here with me." Bethany smiled at the boy, noting his curious eyes the same gray as his uncle's. "Hello, Thomas. It's nice to meet you." Thomas studied her for a moment before seeming to make up his mind. "Does this mean we'll have real food again? Uncle Marshall burns everything except coffee." Marshall laughed, a sound that transformed his face completely. "I'm not that bad." "You are," Thomas insisted. "Remember the biscuits that were black on the outside and still dough on the inside?" Bethany found herself smiling despite everything. "Well, I'm quite good at biscuits, actually." "Thank the Lord," Thomas said dramatically, which earned him a gentle cuff on the ear from his uncle. "Show Miss Foster to the housekeeper's room, will you, Thomas? The one off the kitchen, and then maybe you could fetch some water for her to wash up." Thomas nodded eagerly and gestured for Bethany to follow him. As she stepped down from the wagon, Marshall caught her eye. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We can talk about your duties tomorrow. You're safe here, Miss Foster." Something in his voice made her believe him. The housekeeper's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a basin, and a window that looked out onto a kitchen garden gone slightly wild with neglect. Thomas brought her water, soap, and towels, then disappeared, only to return minutes later with his arms full of clothing. "These were my mother's," he explained, setting them carefully on the bed. "Uncle Marshall kept them. I think they might fit you." Bethany touched the fabric, simple dresses and blouses, but of good quality and in far better condition than what she was wearing. "Thank you, Thomas. That's very kind." The boy shrugged, suddenly shy. "Uncle Marshall says we should help folks when we can. He helped me when my folks died of the fever 3 years back." Later, after washing away the dust and changing into one of the dresses, which fit reasonably well with only minor adjustments needed, Bethany ventured into the kitchen. It was large and well-appointed, but showed signs of bachelor living, a stack of unwashed dishes, spilled coffee grounds on the counter, and a general air of disuse. "I was about to start on supper," Marshall said, appearing in the doorway. He'd changed, too, into a clean shirt with his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. "But if you're feeling up to it." "I'd be glad to," Bethany said, already surveying what she had to work with. "Though I'll need to know what supplies you have." Marshall showed her the pantry, which was surprisingly well stocked. "I make a trip into town for supplies once a month," he explained. "Just never had the knack for turning it into proper meals." Within an hour, Bethany had put together a simple but hearty meal of fried salt pork, beans, and the biscuits she'd promised. The look of appreciation on both Marshall's and Thomas's faces as they ate made her feel useful for the first time in months. "This is what food is supposed to taste like," Thomas declared, reaching for another biscuit. "Thank you, Miss Foster," Marshall said, his voice sincere. "It's been a while since we've eaten this well." "Bethany," she corrected gently. "If I'm to call you Marshall, then you should call me Bethany." He nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Bethany, then." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Bethany stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day's events. She'd woken up facing an auction block and the terrifying prospect of being sold to a man like Jeb Thornton. Now she was in a clean bed with a full stomach, employed by a man who'd paid 50 times what anyone else was willing to offer, not to own her, but to free her. It didn't make sense. Men like Marshall Ingram didn't exist in her experience. There had to be something he wasn't telling her, some catch she hadn't seen yet. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help feeling that, for the first time in a very long time, she might actually be safe. The days fell into a rhythm at the Ingram ranch. Bethany rose early to prepare breakfast, then spent her days cleaning, washing, mending, and cooking. The house, which had clearly been neglected, began to shine under her care. Marshall paid her weekly, as promised, and she tucked the money carefully away, slowly building the beginnings of what might someday be independence. Marshall himself was often busy with the ranch, checking fences, tending to the cattle, breaking horses in the corral. Thomas helped when he wasn't studying his books under Bethany's supervision. Marshall was insistent that the boy get an education. "My sister would have wanted him to be more than just a rancher," Marshall explained one evening as they sat on the porch after Thomas had gone to bed. "Not that there's anything wrong with ranching, but a boy should have choices." Bethany nodded, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "You've done well by him." Marshall was quiet for a moment. "I try. Never thought I'd be raising a child. Always figured I'd have my own someday, but life had other plans." "There's still time," Bethany said softly, then felt her cheeks warm at her boldness, but Marshall just smiled. "Maybe so." As summer gave way to fall, Bethany found herself watching Marshall more and more. The way he spoke kindly to his horses, how patient he was teaching Thomas to rope, the quiet strength in his hands as he worked. He wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, his words carried weight, and sometimes she caught him watching her too. When she sang to herself while kneading bread, or when she read aloud to Thomas in the evenings. Once, she looked up from the garden where she was harvesting late vegetables to find him leaning against the fence, a look on his face she couldn't quite decipher. "You've brought life back to this place," he said simply, then turned and walked away before she could respond. One crisp October morning, Bethany was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders came into view, their manner setting off alarm bells in her mind. She hurried inside to find Marshall. "Riders coming," she said, finding him at his desk going over accounts. 3 men, they don't look friendly." Marshall's face hardened. He stood, checking the revolver at his hip. "Stay inside with Thomas." But Thomas had already heard the commotion and came running. "Who is it, Uncle Marshall?" "Trouble," Marshall said grimly. "Both of you stay in the house." Through the window, Bethany watched as Marshall walked out to meet the riders. She recognized one immediately: Jeb Thornton, the man who had tried to buy her at the auction. Fear gripped her heart. "That's him," she whispered to Thomas. "The man who tried to buy me before your uncle stepped in." Thomas's eyes widened. "Uncle Marshall won't let them take you." Outside, the men had dismounted, and though she couldn't hear what was being said, the confrontational stance of the visitors was clear. Jeb was gesturing angrily, pointing toward the house, while Marshall stood his ground, one hand resting near his gun. "I can't just hide in here," Bethany said suddenly, her fear transforming into determination. This man had saved her. She wouldn't cower while he faced danger on her behalf. Despite Thomas's protests, she stepped outside onto the porch. Marshall glanced back, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration at her appearance. "There she is," Jeb called out, his voice slurred even at this hour of the morning. "The woman you stole from me, Ingram." "I didn't steal anything," Marshall replied evenly. "I paid fair and square at a public auction." "You outbid me with money you had no right to spend," Jeb spat. "Everyone knows your ranch is barely breaking even." Marshall's expression didn't change. "My finances aren't your concern, Thornton. Miss Foster is employed here of her own free will. Now I suggest you and your friends leave my property." One of the other men, a thin, rat-faced individual, sneered. "We heard you've been keeping her real comfortable, Ingram. Sharing your bed with bought goods." Bethany gasped at the crude implication, and Marshall's face darkened dangerously. "You watch your mouth, Reynolds, or I'll shut it for you permanently." Jeb took a step forward. "We ain't leaving without her. Town's talking about how you paid $100 for a woman worth $2. Makes a man wonder what's so special about her." His eyes raked over Bethany, making her skin crawl. "Maybe we should find out." In one fluid motion, Marshall drew his gun. "You take one more step, and it'll be your last." The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Bethany held her breath. Fear and something else, something that felt like pride in Marshall's defense of her, warring in her chest. "You can't watch her day and night, Ingram," Jeb said finally, backing down but his eyes cold with threat. "Sooner or later, she'll be unprotected. And then we'll see who she belongs to." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Marshall said, his voice like steel. "Now get off my land." The men mounted their horses and rode away, but Bethany knew this wasn't the end. As soon as they were out of sight, Marshall holstered his gun and strode toward the house, his face tight with concern. "You shouldn't have come outside," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only worry. "Those men are dangerous." "I couldn't let you face them alone," Bethany replied, surprised by her own courage. "Not when they came here because of me." Marshall's expression softened. "They came here because Thornton's pride was hurt and because he's a man who thinks he can own people. None of that is your fault." That night after Thomas was asleep, Marshall and Bethany sat at the kitchen table, the lamplight casting long shadows across the worn wood. "They'll be back," Bethany said quietly. "Or they'll wait until I go into town." Marshall nodded, his face grim. "Likely so." "Perhaps I should leave," she suggested, though the thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Marshall and Thomas, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. "Go somewhere Thornton can't find me." "And where would that be?" Marshall asked. "A woman alone isn't safe anywhere, especially not with men like Thornton around." "Then what do we do?" Marshall was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. "There is one solution," he said finally, his voice hesitant in a way she'd never heard before. "Though I had hoped to approach this matter differently, with more time." Bethany looked at him questioningly. "Marriage," he said simply. "As my wife, you'd have protection under the law that you don't have as my employee. Thornton wouldn't dare touch a married woman, not with the sheriff and the judge being friends of mine." Bethany stared at him, stunned. "You're proposing marriage as a practical arrangement," Marshall met her gaze steadily. "I'm proposing marriage because it's the best way I know to keep you safe. But I won't pretend there aren't other reasons I'm suggesting it." "Other reasons?" Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "I've grown fond of you, Bethany, more than fond. Thomas adores you. And I hope you might feel something for us too, for this place, for the life we could build here." Bethany's eyes filled with tears. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Marshall said gently. "I know you're kind and hardworking. I know you treat Thomas like he matters." I know you sing when you think no one's listening, and that you love watching the sunset from the porch. I know that when you smile, it lights up the room. And I know that the thought of anything happening to you makes me feel like I can't breathe." A tear slipped down Bethany's cheek. "That sounds a lot like love, Marshall Ingram." "I believe it is," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I didn't plan on it happening this way or this fast." "Neither did I," Bethany admitted. "But here we are." Marshall reached across the table and took her hand in his. "So what do you say, Bethany Foster? Will you marry me? Not just for protection, but because I think we could be happy together." Bethany looked at their joined hands, then up into his eyes, those gray eyes that had first captured her attention on the auction block, now filled with a tenderness she'd come to treasure. "Yes," she said simply. "I will." The wedding was a small, quiet affair held in the town's small church just 2 days later. The sheriff stood as witness, along with his wife, and Thomas served as ring-bearer, his face solemn with the importance of his duty. Bethany wore one of the nicer dresses that had belonged to Marshall's sister, altered slightly to fit her better. Marshall wore his best suit, his usually unruly hair slicked back, his face cleanly shaven for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Marshall's kiss was gentle but full of promise. As they signed the marriage certificate, Bethany felt a sense of wonder at how her life had changed in just a few short months, from being auctioned for $2 to becoming Mrs. Marshall Ingram, with a gold band on her finger and a future spread out before her. They emerged from the church to find Jeb Thornton and his companions watching from across the street. Marshall's arm tightened protectively around Bethany's waist, but the sheriff, who had followed them out, called out loudly, "Congratulations to the new Mr. and Mrs. Ingram. May your union be blessed with many happy years." The pointed look he gave Thornton wasn't lost on anyone. A married woman was off limits, even to men like Jeb. The law and the community would protect her now in a way they hadn't been able to before. Jeb spat on the ground and turned away, his cronies following. Bethany knew it wasn't necessarily the end of their troubles. Men like that held grudges, but it was a start. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a new kind of tension, an awareness that their relationship had fundamentally changed. Thomas chattered excitedly about the wedding and the cake the sheriff's wife had given them, seemingly oblivious to the charged atmosphere between the adults. That evening, after a celebratory supper, Thomas went to bed early, leaving Marshall and Bethany alone. They stood awkwardly in the main room, neither quite sure how to navigate this new territory. "I meant what I said," Marshall finally broke the silence. "About not expecting anything. This can be whatever you want it to be, Bethany." "If you need time," Bethany stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beat strongly beneath her palm. "I've had time, Marshall. Time to watch you, to know you, to fall in love with you." His eyes darkened and he covered her hand with his own. "Are you sure?" In answer, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. Unlike the chaste kiss in the church, this one deepened quickly. Years of Marshall's solitude and months of growing feelings between them culminating in a passionate embrace that left them both breathless. Later, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, Marshall traced gentle patterns on Bethany's bare shoulder. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted quietly. "After Claire, my fiancée, died in that influenza outbreak 6 years ago, I figured that was it for me. That I'd just work the ranch until I couldn't anymore, then leave it to Thomas." Bethany propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "And now," a slow smile spread across his face, "now I'm thinking maybe we could add to our family, give Thomas some cousins to grow up with." The thought of children, their children, made Bethany's heart swell with joy. "I'd like that very much. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. The days grew shorter, but the Ingram household grew warmer, the three of them settling into a family rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Jeb Thornton and his men made one more attempt in early December, showing up drunk and belligerent at the ranch during a snowstorm. But Marshall was ready for them, and with the help of two of his ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, he sent them packing with a warning that next time he wouldn't be so merciful. 2 days later, word came that Thornton had left town, apparently heading for California after a particularly bad night of gambling left him deeply in debt to some dangerous men. Bethany felt a weight lift from her shoulders at the news. Christmas that year was the happiest Bethany could remember. Thomas received the books and new boots he'd been hoping for. Marshall got a fine new saddle blanket that Bethany had been secretly working on for weeks, and Bethany was given a beautiful silver locket containing a tiny photograph of the three of them that Marshall had somehow arranged to have taken when they were in town. But the best gift came after Thomas had gone to bed, when Marshall took Bethany's hands in his and told her, with tears shining in his normally stoic eyes, that he'd never imagined he could be this happy again. "When I saw you on that auction block," he confessed, "something inside me just knew. I couldn't explain it then, and I'm not sure I can explain it now, but I think my heart recognized yours, even before we'd spoken a single word." Bethany leaned her forehead against his. "You paid $2 that day, Marshall Ingram, but what you really gave me was your whole heart." "And I'd do it again," he whispered, pulling her close. 1,000 times over." As the snow fell gently outside, blanketing their little corner of the Wild West in peaceful white, Bethany and Marshall held each other by the fire, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as an act of rescue had transformed into the greatest love either of them had ever known. By spring, the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie, and Bethany had news of her own to share. She was expecting their first child. The look of wonder and joy on Marshall's face when she told him was something she knew she would treasure forever. Thomas was equally excited about becoming a cousin brother, as he called it, immediately offering name suggestions and volunteering to help with the baby. Life on the Ingram Ranch continued to flourish. Marshall's cattle business improved under his careful management, and with Bethany's help, they expanded into breeding horses as well. The house, once just a place to sleep and eat, became a true home, filled with laughter, love, and eventually, the cries and coos of their daughter, Sarah Claire Ingram, born on a warm September evening in 1877. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, James Thomas Ingram, completing their family. By then, Thomas was 16 and studying with the town's lawyer, having discovered a passion for justice and the law. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were playing in the yard, Bethany and Marshall would sit on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, and marvel at how their lives had unfolded. "You ever think about that day?" Bethany asked once. "The auction?" Marshall nodded, his expression solemn. "I think about how close I came to not being there. I wasn't even planning to go into town that day if I hadn't run out of coffee." Bethany shuddered at the thought of what might have been. It's strange how life turns on such small moments. "Not so strange," Marshall disagreed gently. "I think some things are meant to be, coffee or no coffee." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You and me, for instance." As the sun set over the prairie they both loved, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Bethany leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful beyond words for the man who had valued her when no one else would, who had offered her not just safety but partnership, not just protection but love. From $2 to a lifetime of happiness, it was a price neither of them would ever regret paying.